Margaret Hartley arrived in Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1886 with $17, a worn leather suitcase, and a surname that meant nothing, because she had divorced back east, and in Laramie County, near Cheyenne. That meant she was not a widow, not a maiden, and certainly not welcome. She thought no one would ask about her past, that the anonymity of the West would shield her, that hard work and a lowered head would be enough. She was wrong. The town knew. The town always knew. And when winter came too early and supplies ran out before Christmas, Margaret discovered that the greatest threat was not the cold that cut to the bone or the hunger that left her hands shaking. It was the choice between accepting protection from a man who expected something in return or facing the silent judgment of a community that waited, almost eagerly, to see her break. 6 months would teach her that freedom has a price no one warns you about before they collect. Before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you watching this from? City and country. I read every comment. Margaret had come from Philadelphia. That much she told the landlady at the boarding house, though she left out the rest. She left out the marriage that had lasted 3 years and felt like 30. She left out the courtroom where a judge had signed papers that made her legally free and socially ruined. She left out the way her own mother had turned her face to the wall when Margaret came to say goodbye. Divorce was not a word spoken in polite company. It was a stain, a scandal, a mark that followed you like smoke. So she went west. Not because she believed in new beginnings, she was not that naive, but because distance was the only currency she had left. She bought a ticket on the Union Pacific 3rd class and sat for 2 days and 2 nights on a wooden bench that smelled of coal smoke and unwashed wool. The train rattled through Nebraska, through endless stretches of grass that turned gold under a sky so wide it made her feel like she was falling upward. The other passengers did not speak to her much. A woman traveling alone was either a widow or a problem, and Margaret's clothes were too fine to be the former. She arrived in Cheyenne on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The platform was crowded with men in dusty boots and women in bonnets faded by sun and wind. The air smelled of livestock and dry earth and something else she could not name. Emptiness, perhaps. Space. The kind of silence that made you aware of your own breathing. She picked up her suitcase and walked into town, her heels clicking against the wooden planks, her heart beating too fast. The boarding house sat on the edge of 16th Street, a narrow 2-story building with peeling paint and a sign that read, "Rooms by the week." The landlady was a woman named Mrs. Kellogg, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, who looked Margaret up and down like she was assessing livestock. "You got money?" she asked. Margaret nodded. "You got work?" Margaret hesitated. "Not yet." Mrs. Kellogg sniffed. "Rent's $2 a week, in advance, no men in the rooms, no cooking after 9. You break something, you pay for it." Margaret handed over $4, 2 weeks to buy herself time, and was given a key to a room on the 2nd floor that smelled of lye soap and old wood. The room was small, a bed with a thin mattress, a chair, a wash basin, a single window that looked out onto an alley where a dog nosed through garbage. Margaret set her suitcase on the bed and sat beside it. The walls were so thin she could hear the woman in the next room coughing. She could hear boots on the stairs. She could hear the wind pressing against the glass. She did not cry. She had made a rule about that. Crying was a luxury she could not afford. The next morning she went looking for work. She walked up and down the main streets, 17th Capitol, Ferguson, stopping at dry goods stores, laundries, boarding houses, anywhere a woman might be hired. Most did not bother to hear her out. "We're full up," they said, or "try back in spring," or nothing at all, just a shake of the head. One man, the owner of a general store, looked her over and said, "You married?" She said no. He said, "Then I can't help you." She understood what he meant. A single woman was a risk. A divorced woman was worse. By the end of the first week, she had found only 2 sources of income. A seamstress on Cary Avenue agreed to pay her 10 cents per garment for hemming and mending, work Margaret could take back to her room and finish by candlelight. And a woman named Mrs. Talbot, who ran a boarding house near the rail depot, hired her to wash linens twice a week for 50 cents a load. It was not enough, not even close, but it was something. October arrived cold and fast. The mornings were sharp with frost. The sky turned pale and hard, like glass. Margaret walked to Mrs. Talbot's before dawn, her breath smoking in the air, her hands already aching from the cold. She scrubbed sheets and pillowcases in water so cold it made her fingers go numb, then hung them on lines in the yard where the wind whipped them dry. The work was brutal. Her back hurt. Her hands cracked and bled, but she did not complain. Complaint was another luxury. She noticed the way people looked at her, or rather, the way they did not look at her. In Philadelphia, she had been invisible because she was ordinary. Here, she was invisible because she was suspect. Women crossed the street to avoid her. Shopkeepers served her last. At church, she had tried going once, hoping it might soften the town's opinion. She was seated alone in the back pew, and no one spoke to her afterward. She was a stranger. Worse, she was a stranger without a man to vouch for her. That made her dangerous in ways she had not anticipated. The wind that month carried grit that settled between her teeth like sandpaper. The nights grew longer. The stove in her room barely kept the cold at bay, and coal cost money she did not have. She began wearing her coat indoors. She ate less, bread and butter, sometimes an egg. Once, a tin of sardines that tasted like rust and salt. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself winter would not last forever. But she could feel it coming, heavy and inevitable, like a door slowly closing. She had survived a marriage. She had survived a courtroom. She had survived her mother's silence. But the prairie had a way of remembering, and it did not forgive easily. By late October, Margaret understood that she had miscalculated badly. She had thought the cold would be manageable. She had thought her savings would stretch further. She had thought, foolishly, that hard work would be enough to earn her a place in this town. None of it was true. The cold was not manageable. It was relentless, creeping through gaps in the window frame, seeping up through the floorboards, settling into her bones like an ache that never left. Her savings were nearly gone, and hard work, she was learning, only mattered if someone was willing to pay for it. The seamstress on Cary Avenue had less work to offer now. People mend their own clothes in winter, she said, not unkindly. They don't have the money for it. Mrs. Talbot still needed laundry done, but only once a week now instead of twice. Margaret did the math in her head, over and over, as if repetition might change the answer. 50 cents a week from laundry, maybe another 30 or 40 from sewing if she was lucky. Rent was $2. Coal was 15 cents a bucket, and a bucket lasted 3 days if she was careful. Bread was 5 cents a loaf, butter 8. Eggs, when she could afford them, 10 cents a dozen. The numbers did not add up. They never did. She began skipping meals. Not dramatically. She could not afford to collapse, but strategically. Breakfast became coffee, black and bitter, brewed from grounds she used twice. Lunch disappeared entirely. Dinner was bread, sometimes with a scraping of lard if her hands were steady enough to make it last. She grew thinner. Her dresses hung looser. Her face, when she glimpsed it in the small mirror above the wash basin, looked angular and pale, like something carved from soap. The first snow came in early November, a wet, heavy snow that turned the streets to mud and made walking treacherous. Margaret slipped twice on her way to Mrs. Talbot's, catching herself hard on her palms, the cold mud soaking through her gloves. She washed the laundry outside as usual, her hands so numb she could barely feel the fabric. When she hung the sheets on the line, the wind snapped them like sails, and she thought absurdly of ships, of leaving, of being somewhere else. But there was nowhere else. This was as far as her money had carried her. She began to notice the way the town watched her. Not with hostility exactly, with something worse. Patience. They were waiting. Waiting for her to fail. Waiting for her to beg. Waiting for her to do what they assumed she would eventually do. Marry or leave, or quietly disappear. She saw it in the eyes of the shopkeeper when she counted out coins for a half loaf of bread. She saw it in the face of Mrs. Kellogg when she paid her rent 3 days late, and offered an apology that was met with silence. She saw it in the Sunday congregation, where she still sat alone, her presence tolerated, but never acknowledged. There were no friends, no allies. The other women at the boarding house kept to themselves, and Margaret did not blame them. Association with her would taint them by proximity. She was a divorced woman, a woman without protection, a woman who had chosen to leave a husband, which meant she was either a liar or a fool, and either way, not someone you wanted your name attached to. So they nodded when they passed her in the hallway. They said nothing when she coughed through the thin walls at night. They pretended she was not there. The loneliness was a physical thing. It sat in her chest like a stone she could not swallow. It made her aware of every sound, the creak of her own footsteps, the scrape of her chair, the way her breath caught when the wind slammed against the window. She thought about writing a letter, to her mother maybe, to an old friend from Philadelphia. But what would she say? That she was cold? That she was hungry? That she had been right to leave but wrong to think leaving would save her? No. She folded the impulse away and did not touch it again. By mid-November, the snow was constant. It piled in drifts against the buildings, turned the alleyways into tunnels of white silence. Margaret's room was so cold that frost formed on the inside of the window, delicate and beautiful, and utterly unforgiving. She burned through her small supply of coal in 4 days and could not afford to buy more. She stuffed rags into the gaps around the window frame. She slept in her coat, in her stockings, curled tight under a single blanket that smelled of mildew and old smoke. She woke shivering. She went to bed shivering. The cold was not loud. It was quiet, and it seeped into everything. She began taking on any work she could find, no matter how small. She scrubbed floors for a saloon owner who paid her 20 cents and did not look at her face. She hauled firewood for an elderly man on Warren Avenue who gave her a dime and a crust of cornbread. She mended a torn saddle for a ranch hand who paid her in tobacco she could not use and traded later for a tin of beans. It was not pride that kept her working. It was the alternative. The alternative was surrender. And then, one afternoon in late November, Thomas Crowley came to town. She did not know his name yet. She only saw him from a distance, standing outside the land office, a tall man in a heavy coat, his hat pulled low against the wind. He was speaking to another man, gesturing toward the mountains, and something about the way he stood, solid, unhurried, like someone who owned the ground beneath his boots, made her look twice. She did not think much of it. Men like that were common enough in Wyoming. Ranchers, homesteaders, men who had claimed their piece of the territory and made it work. But that evening at the boarding house, Mrs. Kellogg mentioned him. "Thomas Crowley's back in town," she said to another tenant, a woman named Mrs. Phipps who worked at the post office. "Heard he's looking for help at his place. Lost his housekeeper last month." Mrs. Phipps made a non-committal sound. "He won't find one easy, not after what happened to his wife." Mrs. Kellogg lowered her voice, though not enough that Margaret could not hear. "Childbirth, third one. Baby didn't make it either." There was a pause. "He's got 2 boys left. Good land, though. Cattle. Does well for himself." Margaret said nothing. She sat in the corner of the parlor, mending a pair of trousers by the light of a single lamp, her needle moving in steady mechanical strokes. But she heard. She always heard. The snow kept falling. The temperature dropped. And Margaret Hartley, who had come west to escape one kind of cage, began to feel the walls of another closing in. Thomas Crowley came to the boarding house on a Thursday morning in early December. Margaret was in her room, sewing a patch onto the elbow of a shirt she had been hired to mend, when she heard the knock downstairs. Heavy, deliberate, the kind of knock that expected an answer. She heard Mrs. Kellogg's voice, low and careful, and then footsteps on the stairs. A man's footsteps. Slow and steady, like someone who did not need to hurry. Then Mrs. Kellogg was at her door. "Miss Hartley," she said, her tone flat, "you have a visitor." Margaret set down her needle. Her heart kicked once, hard, against her ribs. Visitors were not a thing that happened to her, not here, not ever. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and followed Mrs. Kellogg down the narrow staircase to the parlor, where a man stood with his hat in his hands, snow still dusting the shoulders of his coat. He was older than she had thought from a distance. 40, maybe. 45. His face was weathered, creased at the eyes and mouth, the kind of face that came from years of wind and sun and work that did not stop. His hair was dark, streaked with gray at the temples. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read, not unkind, but not warm either. Assessing, the way a man might look at a horse he was thinking of buying. "Miss Hartley," he said. His voice was low, steady. "My name is Thomas Crowley. I own a cattle ranch about 12 miles north of here. I'm looking for someone to help manage the house. Cooking, cleaning, mending, looking after my boys when I'm out with the herd." He paused. "Mrs. Kellogg said you might be available." Margaret glanced at Mrs. Kellogg, who stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, watching. She turned back to Crowley. "I have work here," she said carefully. "Sewing, laundry." "I know," he said. "I also know it's not enough." He said it plainly, without cruelty, a fact, nothing more. "I'm offering room and board, separate quarters, a wage of $8 a month paid on the first." He looked at her directly. "It's honest work, Miss Hartley, and it's more than you're making now. $8 a month, room and board. It was more than honest. It was a lifeline." Margaret's throat tightened. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep her face still. "How many in the household?" she asked. "3, he said. "Me and my 2 boys. Samuel's 8. Jacob's 5. He hesitated just slightly. "My wife passed 2 years ago. We've managed on our own since then, but it's difficult, especially in winter." Margaret nodded slowly. She could feel Mrs. Kellogg's eyes on her back. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing down like the cold itself. This was what she had been waiting for, wasn't it? A way to survive the winter. A roof that did not leak. Food that was not rationed down to crumbs. But something in the way he stood there, patient and certain, made her hesitate. He was offering work. But what else was he offering? And what would he expect in return? "I'll need to think about it," she said. Crowley nodded, as if he had expected that. "Of course," he said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of paper, folded once. "That's the location of the ranch. If you decide you're interested, come out on Monday. I'll be there." He set the paper on the table between them. "If you don't come, I'll understand." He put his hat back on, nodded once to Mrs. Kellogg, and left. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound. Margaret stood there, staring at the folded paper, her hands cold and still at her sides. Mrs. Kellogg spoke first. "You'd be a fool not to take it." Margaret looked at her. "Would I?" Mrs. Kellogg's expression did not change. "He's a decent man, a widower, good land. He's not offering charity, Miss Hartley. He's offering work." She paused. "But if you think you can make it through winter on 50 cents a week and pride, you're welcome to try." Margaret picked up the paper. She did not unfold it. She carried it upstairs to her room and set it on the small table beside the bed. Then she sat down and stared at it for a long time. She did not go on Monday. She told herself it was because she needed more time, because she needed to be sure, because accepting help from a man she did not know felt like stepping into a trap she could not see the edges of. But the truth, the part she did not want to admit, was that she was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean. Afraid of what he might expect. Afraid that once she stepped onto his land, into his house, she would lose the one thing she had fought so hard to keep, the ability to say no. The cold deepened. December pressed in like a hand around her throat. She burned the last of her coal. She ate bread so stale it had to be soaked in water to chew. She worked until her fingers bled, and still it was not enough. The rent came due again. She paid it. Barely. Mrs. Kellogg took the money without comment, but her silence said everything. And then, 10 days after Crowley's visit, he came back. This time he did not come to the door. He was waiting outside when Margaret returned from Mrs. Talbot's, standing beside a wagon hitched to 2 horses, their breath steaming in the frozen air. He saw her and straightened. She stopped on the walkway, her hands clutching the small bundle of laundry she had brought home to mend. "Miss Hartley," he said. She did not answer. She waited. "I came to see if you'd made a decision," he said. His tone was still even, still patient. But there was something else now, a weight behind the words. "Winter's not getting easier, and I still need help." Margaret looked at him, at the wagon, at the horses, at the road behind him that led north, out of town, into open country where the snow lay thick and unbroken. She thought about her room, about the frost on the window, about the silence that pressed in every night like something alive. She thought about the choice in front of her, his offer or this, survival or slow collapse. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Crowley," she said quietly, "but I can't accept it." His face did not change, but something shifted in his eyes, surprise maybe, or disappointment. "Can I ask why?" She chose her words carefully. "Because I came here to be independent, and working in your house, living on your land. It wouldn't be that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I understand," he said. He climbed back onto the wagon, gathered the reins. "If you change your mind, the offer stands, at least through Christmas." He did not wait for a reply. He clicked his tongue and the horses started forward, pulling the wagon down the street and out of sight. Margaret stood there, watching until he was gone. The wind picked up. The cold bit through her coat. Her hands were shaking. She went inside. She climbed the stairs. She closed the door to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. She had said no. She had kept her independence. But independence, she was learning, was just another word for alone. And alone, in the middle of a Wyoming winter, was a dangerous thing to be. By the next morning, the town knew. Word spread the way it always did in small places, through whispers at the post office, through conversations at the general store, through Mrs. Kellogg's carefully neutral tone when she mentioned it to Mrs. Phipps over breakfast. Margaret Hartley had turned down Thomas Crowley's offer. A good offer, from a good man. And now people were talking. Some said she was proud. Others said she was foolish. A few said worse, that she was waiting for something better, that she thought herself above honest work, that a divorced woman had no business being particular about anything. Margaret heard none of it directly, but she felt it, in the way the seamstress looked at her when she came to pick up mending, in the way the shopkeeper hesitated before handing her change, in the way Mrs. Kellogg's silence grew heavier, colder, like the air itself. Choices had costs, even when they were the right ones. Margaret was beginning to understand that. But understanding did not make the cost any easier to bear. The refusal changed things. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the days that followed, Margaret noticed the shift. The seamstress on Cary Avenue stopped calling her when work came in. "I've got someone else handling it now," she said when Margaret stopped by to ask. No apology, no explanation. Just a door closing, quietly but completely. Mrs. Talbot still let her wash laundry, but now it was every other week instead of every week, and the pay dropped to 40 cents because times are tight, you understand. Margaret understood. She understood perfectly. She was being punished, not formally, not openly, but in the small, deliberate ways a community enforces its will. By mid-December, her income had shrunk to almost nothing. She had $2.30 left to her name. Rent was due in 5 days. She did not have it. She would not have it. And Mrs. Kellogg was not a woman who extended credit. So Margaret did what she had always done. She adapted. She started offering her services directly door to door, walking the residential streets on the north side of town where the houses were larger and the families had money. She knocked and introduced herself and explained that she could sew, mend, clean, cook, tutor children in reading and arithmetic. Most doors closed before she finished speaking. A few stayed open long enough to say no politely. But one woman, a banker's wife named Mrs. Vandenberg, hired her to hem a set of curtains for 35 cents. It took Margaret 4 hours of work by candlelight, her eyes aching, her fingers stiff from the cold. But it was 35 cents. She found a man on Ferguson Street who needed his barn mucked out. He paid her 20 cents and a sack of potatoes that had started to sprout but were still edible. She boiled them with salt and ate them for 3 days straight, the taste bland and gritty but filling enough to quiet her stomach. She fixed a broken fence for a widow on 20th Street in exchange for a loaf of bread and a jar of preserves. She taught a Polish immigrant family's daughter to read English for 2 hours a week, paid in firewood, 6 logs that she carried back to the boarding house on her shoulder, her legs trembling by the time she reached her room. It was not sustainable, she knew that, but it was survival. And survival, Margaret had learned, did not require dignity. It only required stubbornness. The town still watched. If anything, the scrutiny grew sharper. She could feel it when she walked to the post office, when she stood in line at the general store, when she sat alone at the back of the church on Sundays. People whispered. She caught fragments. Too proud. Won't last. Should have taken Crowley's offer. She kept her head down. She kept moving. The hardest part was not the work. It was being misunderstood. It was knowing that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, the town had already decided what kind of woman she was. Christmas came and went. Margaret spent it alone in her room, eating a piece of bread she had saved and listening to the sounds of laughter from the other tenants downstairs. Mrs. Kellogg had put up a small tree in the parlor, decorated with strings of popcorn and paper stars. Margaret had not been invited to help. She had not expected to be. On the 27th of December, she ran out of coal entirely. The temperature that night dropped below 0. She stuffed every gap in the window with fabric torn from an old petticoat. She piled both her blankets on the bed and lay beneath them fully clothed, her breath visible in the air, her body curled tight to conserve warmth. She did not sleep. She shivered through the night, drifting in and out of a half-conscious state where the cold felt less like a sensation and more like a presence, something heavy and patient pressing down on her chest. In the morning, she was so stiff she could barely stand. Her fingers would not bend. Her feet were numb inside her boots. She forced herself upright, forced herself to move, forced herself to go downstairs and out into the street, because staying still felt like dying. She walked to the edge of town, to a stand of cottonwoods where deadfall wood lay scattered beneath the snow. She gathered what she could carry, small branches, twigs, anything dry enough to burn, and hauled it back to the boarding house in her arms. It was not much. It would not last long. But it was something. She built a small fire in the stove, just enough to take the edge off the cold, and sat as close to it as she could without burning herself. Her hands shook, not from the cold now, from exhaustion, from hunger, from the weight of carrying herself forward 1 hour at a time with nothing to hold on to, except the knowledge that stopping meant surrender. That afternoon, she walked to the post office and asked if there were any letters for her. There were not. There never were. But she asked anyway because asking felt like proof that she still existed somewhere beyond this town, beyond this room, beyond this version of herself she barely recognized. On her way back, she passed the general store and saw a notice pinned to the board outside. Help wanted. Cook needed for railroad crew, January through March. Meals twice daily. Pay negotiable. She stared at the notice for a long time. Cook. She could cook. She had cooked for her husband, back when she had a husband. She had cooked for herself. How different could it be to cook for a crew? She went inside and asked the storekeeper about it. He looked her over, doubt plain on his face. It's rough work, he said. Camp's 10 miles east. You'd have to live there. No women except the cook. Men work hard, eat hard, don't have much patience for fancy meals. He paused. You sure you're up for that? Margaret met his eyes. I'm sure. He gave her the name of the foreman, a man called Briggs, and told her where to find him. She thanked him and left. She did not know if Briggs would hire her. She did not know if she could handle the work. But it was a chance. And chances, no matter how slim, were better than waiting for mercy that would never come. She went to see Briggs the next day. He was a barrel-chested man with a thick mustache and hands like slabs of granite. He looked at her the way everyone looked at her. Skeptical, wary, already halfway to saying no. But she did not give him time to refuse. She told him she could cook for 50 men if he needed her to. She told him she did not complain, did not gossip, did not cause trouble. She told him she would work for $5 a month and meals, and if he did not like her work after the first week, he could send her back with no hard feelings. Briggs chewed on that for a moment. Then he said, "You start Monday, 6 in the morning. Miss a meal, you're done. Burn the coffee, you're done. 'Cause any kind of scene with my men, you're done." He held out a hand, rough and calloused. "We clear?" Margaret shook it. "We're clear." She walked back to the boarding house with her head up, her spine straight, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She had bought herself time, not much, but enough. When she told Mrs. Kellogg she would be leaving for work at the railroad camp, the landlady's expression did not change. "You'll still owe for the rest of the week," she said. Margaret paid her, every cent she had left, $2.10. It left her with nothing, but it also left her free. She packed her suitcase that night, the same worn leather case she had arrived with, now scuffed and battered from months of use. She folded her 2 dresses, her spare stockings, her coat. She wrapped her sewing kit in a handkerchief. She did not have much. She had never had much. But what she had earned. The next morning, she left the boarding house before dawn. The streets were empty. The sky was pale and cold, the kind of cold that made the air feel brittle. She walked east toward the railroad camp, her breath smoking, her boots crunching through frozen snow. Behind her, the town of Cheyenne faded into the distance. Ahead, there was only the open land, flat and white and endless. She did not look back. She had made a choice, difficult freedom over comfortable constraint. And if that choice came with a cost, then so be it. She had paid worse. The railroad camp was not a town. It was a collection of rough structures scattered across a flat stretch of prairie. Tents, shacks, a few boxcars converted into bunkhouses. The wind came across the open ground with nothing to slow it, sharp and relentless, carrying snow that stung like thrown sand. Margaret arrived just after dawn, her suitcase heavy in her hand, her face numb from the cold. Briggs met her at the edge of camp, gestured toward a small wooden shack near the supply tent and said, "That's yours. Stove's inside. Firewood's over there. Breakfast's at 6. Don't be late." The shack was barely large enough to stand in. A cot, a stove, a shelf. A single window with no glass, just a piece of oiled canvas nailed over the frame to keep out the worst of the wind. Margaret set her suitcase down and looked around. It was cold. It was drafty. It smelled of old smoke and damp wood. But it was hers. And that, for now, was enough. She started work that same morning. The cook tent was larger, equipped with 2 iron stoves, a long table for prep work, and shelves stocked with sacks of flour, beans, salt pork, and coffee. The men expected 3 things: hot food, strong coffee, and no delays. Margaret gave them all 3. She cooked in silence, her hands moving fast and efficient, frying salt pork and potatoes, brewing coffee in large pots that she kept on the stove all morning. The men came through in shifts, eating quickly, barely looking at her. That suited her fine. She was not there to be seen. She was there to survive. The work was brutal. She woke before sunrise every morning, built the fire, started the coffee, began prep for breakfast. By the time the first crew arrived, her hands were already blistered from handling hot pans, and her back ached from bending over the stove. After breakfast came cleanup, then prep for the midday meal, then more cleanup, then dinner. By the time the last man finished eating, it was past 8 at night. She cleaned the pots, wiped down the tables, banked the stove, and stumbled back to her shack, too tired to think, too tired to feel anything except the weight of her own exhaustion. But she did not complain. She did not slow down. She did the work. January came in hard. The temperature dropped so low that water left in buckets overnight froze solid. The wind howled across the plains like something alive, tearing at the canvas on her window, rattling the boards of her shack. Margaret slept in her coat, her blanket pulled up to her chin, and still she woke shivering. Some mornings the stove in her shack would not light, the wood too damp, the air too cold. She would wrap herself in her blanket and walk to the cook tent just to stand near the heat of the stoves while the coffee boiled. The men did not speak to her much. A few nodded when she served them. One, a young man with a scar across his cheek, said, "Thank you," once, quietly, and she nodded back. But mostly they treated her the way they treated the stove or the tent or the tools, as something functional, necessary but not worth noticing. She preferred it that way. It meant no questions, no expectations, no assumptions about what she owed them beyond the food on their plates. But there was one man who watched her. She noticed him in the second week, older than the others, maybe 50, with gray hair and a face weathered into deep lines. He did not eat with the crew. He sat alone at the far end of the tent, and his eyes followed her as she moved from stove to table to serving line. It was not an aggressive stare, but it was persistent, and it made her uneasy in a way she could not name. On a Saturday in mid-January, he approached her after dinner. The other men had left, and she was scrubbing a pot when she heard his voice behind her. "You're doing good work," he said. She did not turn around. "Thank you." "Name's Harlan," he said. "I'm the track supervisor." He paused. "You got a first name?" "Margaret." "Margaret." He said it slowly, like he was tasting it. "You don't talk much, do you?" "I'm here to cook," she said, "not to talk." He laughed, low and rough. "Fair enough." There was a silence, then he said, "You need anything, you'd let me know. It's not easy out here for a woman on her own." She set the pot down and turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, not hostile, not friendly, somewhere in between. "I'm managing fine," she said. He nodded. "I'm sure you are." He turned to leave, then stopped at the tent flap. "Offer stands, though. You change your mind." She did not answer. He left, and she went back to scrubbing the pot, her hands moving harder than they needed to, her jaw tight. The days blurred together. Wake, cook, clean, sleep, wake again. The cold did not relent. The work did not ease. And the isolation, the kind that came not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who did not see you as fully human, settled over her like a second skin. In late January, she got sick. It started as a cough, dry and shallow, that she ignored because there was no time to stop. Then it deepened, turned wet, made her chest ache with every breath. She kept working. She had no choice. Missing a meal meant losing her job, and losing her job meant losing everything. So she cooked through the fever, her hands shaking as she fried eggs, her vision blurring as she poured coffee. The men did not notice, or if they did, they said nothing. On the third day of the fever, she collapsed, not dramatically. She simply sat down on the floor of the cook tent after breakfast, her back against the wall, and could not make herself stand. Her head was heavy. Her lungs burned. The edges of her vision went soft and gray. She did not know how long she sat there, minutes maybe, or hours. Time felt strange, elastic. At some point, someone came in. She heard footsteps, felt a hand on her shoulder, a voice, low and concerned. "Jesus, you're burning up." She opened her eyes. It was the young man with the scar. He crouched beside her, his face close, his expression worried. "Can you stand?" he asked. She nodded, tried, failed. He helped her up, one arm around her waist, supporting her weight. He half-carried her to her shack, eased her onto the cot, covered her with the blanket. "I'll get Briggs," he said. "No." Her voice came out hoarse, barely audible. "I'll be fine. Just need to rest." He hesitated. Then he said, "I'll bring you water, and soup if there's any left." She wanted to say no, wanted to tell him she did not need help, but the words would not come. She closed her eyes, heard him leave, heard the door close. She drifted in and out of consciousness for the next 2 days. Fever dreams, vivid and strange. She dreamed of Philadelphia, of her mother's house, of the courtroom, of Wyoming stretched out endless and white. When she woke, it was night, and someone had left a cup of water and a bowl of cold soup beside her cot. She drank the water, could not manage the soup, slept again. On the third morning, the fever broke. She woke weak and hollow, her body aching, her throat raw. But she could breathe. She could think. She forced herself to sit up, to stand, to walk the few steps to the door. Outside, the sky was pale and clear. The camp was quiet. She had missed 2 days of work, maybe 3. She did not know if Briggs had fired her yet. She walked to the cook tent, unsteady but upright. Briggs was inside, checking supplies. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "You alive?" he asked. "Yes," he nodded. "Good. Get back to work." That was all. No lecture, no punishment. Just an acknowledgement that she had survived, and survival was enough. She cooked that night. Her hands shook, her lungs ached, but she did the work. And when the young man with the scar came through the line, he met her eyes and nodded once, a gesture so small it might have been nothing. But it was not nothing. It was the only kindness she had received in weeks. February arrived. The coldest month. The hardest month. Margaret endured it the way she had endured everything else. 1 day at a time, 1 meal at a time, 1 breath at a time. She did not break. She did not quit. She simply kept moving forward, because stopping was not an option. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Not in the camp, not in the men, but in her. She stopped waiting for things to get easier, stopped hoping someone would see her struggle and offer help. She accepted that this, the cold, the work, the loneliness, was the price she had chosen to pay. And if it was a high price, well, freedom always was. Some loneliness is clean. The other kind stains you from the inside. Margaret was learning the difference. March came slowly, like something hesitant to arrive. The snow did not melt all at once. It softened first, turned gray and heavy, then began to recede in patches, exposing the brown grass beneath. The wind lost some of its edge. The days grew longer. The light changed, became less brittle, less sharp. Margaret noticed these things the way a prisoner notices the shifting of bars, as signs of a sentence nearing its end. The railroad work was finished by mid-March. The tracks had been laid, the crews were moving on, and Briggs paid her what he owed, $15 for 3 months of work. He handed her the bills without ceremony, his face as impassive as ever. "You did good," he said. That was all. But it was enough. She returned to Cheyenne on a cold, clear morning, riding in the back of a supply wagon with 2 other workers who were heading into town. The driver did not ask her any questions. She was grateful for that. She sat in silence, watching the prairie slide past, flat and endless and indifferent. She had left this place in January with nothing. She was returning with $15, a suitcase, and something else. Something harder to name. Not pride, exactly. Not confidence. Just a quiet certainty that she had survived the worst of it. And that mattered. The town looked the same. The same streets, the same buildings, the same people moving through their routines with the same careful indifference. Margaret walked to the boarding house, half expecting Mrs. Kellogg to turn her away, but the landlady only nodded when she asked for a room. $2 a week, she said. Same as before. Margaret paid for 2 weeks in advance and carried her suitcase upstairs to a different room, smaller than the last, but with a window that faced east and let in the morning light. She did not look for work right away. She spent the first few days simply resting, letting her body recover from 3 months of relentless labor. She slept long hours. She ate slowly. She walked through town without purpose, just to feel the ground beneath her feet, to remind herself that she was still here, still standing. But by the end of the first week, she began to notice something strange. People were looking at her differently. Not with warmth. She did not expect that, but with something else, a kind of cautious acknowledgement. The shopkeeper at the general store nodded when she came in. The seamstress on Cary Avenue stopped her on the street and asked if she was available for work again. Mrs. Talbot hired her back for laundry, this time at 60 cents a load instead of 50. No one said it directly. No one apologized for the way they had treated her before. But the change was there, subtle and unmistakable. She had left in disgrace, a woman too proud to accept help. She had returned as a woman who had worked a hard winter at a railroad camp and survived it. That changed things, not everything, but enough. One afternoon in late March, she was walking past the land office when she saw Thomas Crowley. He was tying his horse to the post outside, his coat dusty from the road, his hat pulled low. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. For a second, neither of them moved. Then he straightened, touched the brim of his hat and said, "Miss Hartley." She stopped. "Mr. Crowley." There was a pause. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Heard you worked the railroad camp this winter," he said. "I did." He nodded slowly. "That's hard work." "It was." Another pause. Then he said, "I meant what I said back in December, about the offer. If you're still looking for steady work, it's still available." Margaret met his eyes. There was no judgment there, no resentment, just a man offering work to someone who needed it. She thought about it for a moment, thought about the ranch, the house, the 2 boys, thought about what it would mean to accept now after she had refused before. It would be easier, certainly, steadier, safer, but it would also mean stepping into someone else's life, someone else's expectations. And she was not ready for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I'm managing on my own." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you are." He untied his horse, swung up into the saddle. "Take care of yourself, Miss Hartley." "You too, Mr. Crowley." He rode off, and she watched him go. She felt no regret, no second-guessing. She had made her choice, and she would live with it. That was all anyone could do. By early April, Margaret had established a routine. She sewed for the seamstress 3 days a week. She washed laundry for Mrs. Talbot twice a week. She took on odd jobs when they came, mending, cleaning, tutoring. It was not much, but it was steady. And it was hers. She rented a small room in a boarding house on the quieter side of town, run by a woman named Mrs. Calloway, who did not ask questions and did not gossip. The room was plain but clean, with a stove that worked and a window that did not leak. Margaret kept it sparse: a bed, a chair, a table, her sewing kit, a few books she had bought second-hand. She did not need much. She had learned that the hard way. The town never embraced her. She was still the divorced woman, still the outsider, still the one who had refused help and survived anyway, which made some people respect her and others resent her. But she was no longer invisible. She was no longer waiting to be rescued. She had proven, quietly but undeniably, that she could endure. One Sunday in late April, she went to church. She had stopped going in February, too exhausted and too bitter to sit through another service where no one spoke to her. But now, on a whim, she returned. She sat in the back pew as she always had. The service was the same. The hymns, the prayers, the sermon about faith and perseverance. When it ended, she stood to leave, expecting the usual silence. But this time, a woman stopped her. An older woman, someone Margaret had seen but never spoken to. "Miss Hartley," she said. Her voice was formal, but not unkind. "I wanted to say, we're glad you made it through the winter." Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you," she said. The woman nodded and moved on. It was a small thing, a brief acknowledgement, but it was something. Margaret walked home slowly that afternoon, the sun warm on her face, the air soft and clean. She thought about the past 6 months, about the cold, about the hunger, about the men who had offered help with conditions attached, and the choice she had made to refuse them. She thought about the railroad camp, the fever, the long nights alone in a shack that barely kept out the wind. She thought about the cost of independence, the price of dignity, the weight of carrying yourself forward when no one else would. It had been hard, harder than she had imagined, but she had done it. She had survived, not by compromising, not by surrendering, but by enduring. Sometimes the bravest thing is choosing difficult freedom over comfortable constraint. Margaret understood that now, not as a theory, not as a philosophy, but as a lived truth etched into her bones. She was not happy, not in the way people meant when they used that word, but she was free, and she was whole, and she was still here. That was enough. The prairie did not care who you used to be. It only cared what you could endure. And Margaret Hartley had endured. Spring arrived in full by May. The grass turned green. The sky opened up, wide and blue and impossibly vast. Margaret kept working, kept sewing, kept washing laundry and mending fences and walking the streets of Cheyenne with her head up and her spine straight. She did not make friends. She did not seek approval. She simply lived, day by day, building a life that belonged entirely to her. The town never loved her, but it stopped waiting for her to fail. And in the end, that was its own kind of victory. Years later, long after Margaret had become a fixture in Cheyenne, the quiet woman who worked hard, kept to herself, and never married again, someone would ask her if she regretted coming west, if she regretted refusing Crowley's offer, if she regretted the choices that had made her life harder than it needed to be. She would think about it for a moment. Then she would say simply, no. Because she had learned something that winter. Something the cold and the hunger and the loneliness had taught her. That survival was not the same as surrender. That dignity had a cost, but so did compromise. And that freedom, real freedom, the kind you chose for yourself even when it hurt, was worth defending. Even when no one understood, even when no one helped, even when the price was higher than you thought you could pay. Margaret Hartley had paid it, and she had not broken. That was the story. That was what mattered. And if the town never fully understood her, well, she had stopped needing them to. Have you ever chosen something difficult because the alternative felt like losing yourself? Have you ever stood alone not because you wanted to, but because staying true to who you were demanded it? Share your story in the comments. I read every one.